Good evening, everyone. My name is Kirsten Riak, and I'm the curator of this annual lecture series, which remarkably has now been going for 19 years. It's a pleasure to welcome you all to the Park Avenue Armory, a site whose own layered history offers a powerful backdrop for tonight's conversation. This building was once home to the 7th Regiment of the New York National Guard, whose story lives on not only within these walls, but in the city's public memory. The regiment is commemorated in 2 major monuments in Central Park, each marking a different war, and making their story an especially resonant entry point for tonight's discussion of how we memorialize conflict, service, and civic identity. We're honored to host a scholar whose work asks us to reconsider how history is made visible in our cities and on our streets, and how monuments shape collective memory. Akela Reason is a leading historian of American visual and material culture, and a professor whose research brings sharp insight into the politics of commemoration. Her work examines the complicated afterlives of Civil War monuments, how they were conceived, how they function in civic landscape, and how they continue to inform debates about identity, conflict, and belonging. Her most recent book, Politics and Memory: Civil War Monuments in Gilded Age New York, explores the shifting role these structures have played in our public sphere. Copies of the book will be available for purchase in the library and for signatures after the talk. Tonight, she'll guide us through the histories embedded in the city's Civil War monuments and those of the Gilded Age, illuminating the artistic, social, and political forces that shape them, and inviting us to think critically about the stories we choose to preserve in the public realm of our city. Please join me in welcoming Akela Reason.
Thank you. Thank you, Kirsten, and thanks to Oscar for inviting me to speak about my book tonight. The book examines the intersection of politics and aesthetics in the building of New York City's soldiers' monuments. Oops. For reasons both political and geographic, New York built multiple monuments in honor of the soldiers from the city who fought for Union. Okay. These works span 40 years, from 1862 to 1902, during which time the process for commissioning and building monuments changed substantially, as did the aesthetic preferences of the builders. Indeed, the city's soldiers' monuments employ a wide array of monumental forms. Historians have written extensively about Confederate monuments, which have been the subject of much public debate in recent decades. Union monuments, for a variety of reasons, have received much less scrutiny, and Union monuments in New York City are fundamentally different from Confederate monuments in several critical ways. Perhaps the most important difference is that unlike most Confederate monuments, which were spearheaded by women's groups such as the United Daughters of the Confederacy and built with private funding, New York's soldiers' monuments were built by the city with city funds. Public funding of New York City's monuments was a double-edged sword. Municipal politics in this period was riddled with corruption. Consequently, the city's monuments were often entangled with political schemers who used the projects to pad their own nests through graft. Yet public funding also meant public input, which generally did not influence Confederate monuments. Because these monuments were orchestrated largely by politicians who were less invested in shaping their meaning than veterans groups or ladies' associations, they mostly left the decisions about the iconography, which is the subject matter and what it looks like. They mostly left that decision to the artists. Sculptors, in essence, defined the message of New York's monuments with limited political influence. In addition, because New York City fully embraced the City Beautiful movement, which sought to rationalize and beautify urban landscapes through monument building, New York soldiers' monuments exist in a landscape full of public monument projects unrelated to the war. This is not typically the case in the South, where Confederate monuments continue to dominate urban landscapes. Before we delve into these works, we need to understand how the city itself changed during this time period. In the 1860s, New York was primarily Manhattan. Brooklyn was an independent city, the third largest in the nation behind New York and Philadelphia. The consolidation that created Greater New York and also importantly the city's art commission did not happen until 1898. As you can see in this view, around 1870, there were no bridges connecting Manhattan to Brooklyn or Queens, which were accessible only by ferry. This is important because Manhattan had outlawed burials in the city, so war dead were frequently buried in cemeteries across the East River. New York was also politically different from how we might envision a northern city. In this period, New York was largely Democratic, having rejected the Republican Abraham Lincoln in 2 elections. The city's Democratic Party was also notoriously corrupt, run by machine politicians like Boss Tweed. Another key difference, which may be a little surprising given the landscape that we see today, is that there were almost no sculpted monuments in the city. The first major public sculpture in the city was Henry Kirk Brown's equestrian statue of George Washington in Union Square, which was erected in 1856 and built by a private organization. The story of New York City's Civil War soldiers' monuments begins with this obelisk near Madison Square Park. It's the... Oh, sorry. Oops. Nope. Okay, sorry. Okay. It's the first monument built by the city using public funding, and it's not actually a Civil War monument. It honors Major General William Jenkins Worth, a veteran of the Mexican-American War, and it was completed before the Civil War even began. But this monument is central to Civil War commemoration in Manhattan. The monument's history also provides a useful blueprint for the city's investment in monument building before the 1880s. The design was selected via the same procurement process that the city used for all public works, like sewers or roads. First, a call for bids was advertised in the city papers. After the proposals were received, the contract went to the lowest bidder. There was no room for aesthetic judgment in the system, but there was plenty of opportunity for corruption. In this case, the city went through multiple rounds of bidding because several of the participants worked together to undermine the bidding process by submitting bids under different names to try to find the sweet spot in order to secure the contract. Eventually, the city settled on a bid by James G. Batterson, who was a stonecutter rather than a fine artist. City politicians, in this case Mayor Fernando Wood, often trumpeted their accomplishments with grandiose claims that did not match reality. For the Worth Monument, Wood held a dedication ceremony right before the mayoral election, which he lost, and long before the monument was finished. For the ceremony, the city published this print, depicting the obelisk as if it were complete and appearing much larger than it actually is. Indeed, here is a cartoon depicting the Worth Monument in 1859, almost 2 years after that dedication. Although the monument itself looks complete, if a bit more squat than in the previous image, the site is full of construction debris, and access to the monument is blocked by fencing pasted with advertisements. And this, too, is typical of the period. Monuments were useful demonstrations of political largesse before elections, but they were often left to languish between election cycles. Nonetheless, the Worth Monument's key location at the intersection of Broadway and Fifth Avenue at 23rd Street made it an ideal site for public gatherings after the outbreak of war. More importantly, it was a focal point of post-war parades, such as this one on Decoration Day, also known as Memorial Day. You can see the base of the Worth Monument not so far from the reviewing stand in the distance. The Worth Monument was also one of the monuments of the Grand Army of the Republic veterans decorated on Memorial Day. For these reasons, and because there was no soldiers' monument in Manhattan until 1902, the Worth Monument effectively became a de facto Civil War monument in the city proper. But the city also built 2 official soldiers' monuments in cemeteries. This one in Calvary Cemetery in Queens was the first, commissioned during the war. The monument was finished in 1866. The monument was built in response to a need to bury war dead. But this work is a little bit unusual in that it was not actually supported by Republican members of the city government, because Calvary is a Catholic cemetery, which meant that only Catholic soldiers could be buried there. The city went forward anyway and hired 2 Irish Catholic stonecutters to build the monument you see here, which is a shaft with an allegorical figure of patriotism at the top and figures representing branches of the services around the base. These include an infantryman, who you see here. The figural type became ubiquitous throughout the nation, standing on plinths and public squares in both North and South. And I believe that this statue was one of the first, establishing the precedent for the others that followed. One of the artists responsible for the Calvary Soldiers Monument, Morris Power, appears throughout the book. He founded the National Fine Art Foundry around the time that he completed the Calvary Monument. But he was also a deeply corrupt machine politician who became a Democratic Party boss in the 1880s. He appears to have cheated the city when he built the Calvary Monument, providing zinc sculptures, but billing the city for works made of bronze. Indeed, he was so duplicitous that, according to one account, quote, even Mr. Tweed said that he was not honest because he neglected to divide with him the money received for the work. Powers also cheated the city a second time when he deceptively received the commission for the city's second soldiers' monument by submitting a bid using his brother-in-law's name. This one was built in Brooklyn's Greenwood Cemetery and includes the same 4 figures around the base of the monument. These were also originally made of zinc and sold to the city as bronze statues. Corruption aside, these cemetery monuments were important to veterans. Memorial Day ceremonies included visits to these monuments following the parades around the Worth Monument. In the 1870s and 80s, private groups began building war memorials in public parks in Manhattan. These groups used private funding and sought the work of established fine artists. These 2 works here were crucial to the development of later Civil War monuments built by the city. The statue on the right by John Quincy Adams Ward was commissioned by New York's 7th Regiment, which also built this magnificent armory building. The regiment, composed of elite New Yorkers, contracted directly with the artist, who produced a standing soldier figure not unlike those in the cemetery, but now situated in the public sphere in Central Park. Indeed, this may be the very first such figure to be placed in a civic environment. Augustus St. Gaudens's much-admired Farragut Memorial is among the most successful Civil War monuments of the period. Selected through a competitive process, St. Gaudens's combination of realism and allegory was championed by the city's art press, who advocated for more refined aesthetic discernment in the building of monuments. Both artists partnered with architects, Stanford White in the case of St. Gaudens and Richard Morris Hunt in the case of John Quincy Adams Ward. And architects would become increasingly important for monument building throughout the city. Influenced by such privately funded monuments, Brooklyn Mayor Seth Low proposed a monument to Brooklyn's soldiers by raising a private subscription fund, meaning he went to ask private citizens to contribute to the fund to build the monument. Low hoped that private funding would insulate his monument from politics and corruption. The city consulted with artists and architects, eventually commissioning John Quincy Adams Ward and Richard Morris Hunt to design a Civil War monument that also included references to all wars in which Brooklyn soldiers had fought. Their design, which you see here, was never built, but was astonishing in its scale and ambition. And you can see in the drawing, which is from Richard Morris Hunt's papers, that there's a little man standing at the base of that monument. So it gives you a sense of quite how large this is. And it also has just an enormous number of figural groups. There's 4 equestrian figures and clusters of groups around the base, in addition to the sculpture at the top. In addition, the work also incorporated new themes. For instance, the central frieze, which is right below the crowning sculpture, would have depicted an allegorical figure of liberty, pointing out to the enfranchised Negro groups that typify science, art, agriculture, industry, and education. So that is that this monument would have had a black citizen at its center, which is not anything that appears on public monuments at this time. Unfortunately, Ward and Hunt estimated the monument's cost at $500,000 in 1886, which was double what the city anticipated. In any case, the city had raised only a fraction of the money for the project, and in the end, it had to be scrapped. Low left office, and at this point, the city's aldermen took control, and they held a competition in 1887. They selected a design for a shaft monument by a sculptor named Henry Bayer. Almost immediately, Bayer was accused of bribery, and conflict broke out between different democratic factions within the Brooklyn government. For the record, I don't think Bayer actually cheated anyone. I think he was a sort of a scapegoat to get rid of his design. In 1889, yet another competition was held, and a contract was awarded to the architect John H. Duncan for a triumphal arch. This is Duncan's presentation drawing, which in many respects resembles the arch that now stands in Grand Armory Plaza near Prospect Park. One notable difference is that the sculpture on top of the arch is absent in this drawing. While sculpture was clearly very important to Duncan's design, he never described the iconographic content of the sculptural program. The arch itself was constructed without any clear notion of what the sculpture would look like. 3 years after the arch structure was complete, the city was surprised by the arrival of these 2 panels depicting Lincoln and Grant on horseback. Apparently, Duncan had approved these works on his own and contracted with Morris J. Power, the same unscrupulous character who produced New York's cemetery monuments. Power cast the works by sculptors William Rudolph O'Donovan and the realist painter Thomas Eakins in his foundry, the National Fine Art Foundry. When the reliefs arrived, they were really roundly criticized for being unheroic, and the press urged their removal. But in the end, the city retained the panels, which are located inside the archway facing one another. And Lincoln, who is a lanky figure on his own, looks somewhat awkward on horseback, for sure. But, and some people complained that you could see the interior of his hat, which was not very aesthetic. But Lincoln, in the context of the parades, removes his hat to the troops that would be expected to march underneath the archway. So it's a sign of deference to them. So those sculptures stayed. And in October 1894, the New York Tribune ran an expose regarding the arch, accusing Democratic politicians of malfeasance. That month, a new Republican administration issued a contract to Brooklyn-born sculptor Frederick McMonnies for 3 large sculpture groups for the arch. He was to produce 2 sculptures for the piers facing Prospect Park and a crowning group called a quadriga, showing Columbia in a chariot drawn by 4 horses abreast. To give you a sense of the disconnect between the new administration and the previous democratic regime, as the relief sculptures that are on the inside of the arch were being cast in Powers' studio, the press published these sketches by McMonnies for the piers, depicting the same subjects. McMonnies had no idea that those sculptures were coming, and then was forced to rethink the side groups, which became representations of Army and Navy. McMonnies was a student of St. Gaudens and adopted his mentor's use of realism and allegory in these 2 works. The tumultuous army group features a winged figure of patriotism behind a scrum of men and horses. The young commander in the foreground, with his arm upraised, who appears to be urging the men on, is actually a self-portrait of McMonnies, even though he did not serve in the war. The Navy also includes an allegorical figure, a nude woman representing liberty, who is accompanied by a really large eagle. McMonnies described the scene as depicting men, quote, standing at their guns in preparation for the boarding of the ship by Confederates. And I want to draw your attention to this, to this arresting figure. Of all the men, this young black sailor kneeling by the mortar appears most ready for the impending boarding. He has cocked his pistol in preparation for the fight. While there are other sculpted depictions of African American servicemen from this era, I am not aware of any that show readiness for combat in quite the same way. This would have been a very provocative image at a time when African Americans found their rights severely curtailed. The Brooklyn Soldiers and Sailors Monument took nearly 2 decades to complete because the sculptures for the arch arrived in stages, quadriga first, then Army, then Navy. There was never a formal ceremony marking its completion. Although it was the subject of haphazard planning, the arch, I believe, is still one of the most beautiful and ambitious Civil War monuments ever built. Across the river, New Yorkers fretted that Manhattan had no monument comparable to the Brooklyn Arch. Memorial Day parades still focused on Madison Square around the Worth Monument. Veterans had lobbied for a soldiers' monument in Manhattan since the 1870s, but the project was not funded until 1893. Notably, after Brooklyn finished building their arch, at least the structure of the arch. The city established a monument committee 2 years later, which was composed of the mayor and 3 other city officials and a member of the Grand Army of the Republic. So notably, no artists or architects were involved in this. They appeared not to quite know how to proceed and did not hold a competition until 1897, when they invited an architect to advise them. In the interim, there was conflict over the idea of where to put the monument. The city wanted to build the monument at 5th Avenue and 59th Street near Central Park. But some parties preferred a location in Riverside Park. There were concerns about both sites, some more valid than others. The debates were defined by several partisan constituencies, which included veterans, who were split on the issue of site. The Grand Army of the Republic felt that the Central Park location was the most significant site in the city and would bring prominence to their cause. Navy veterans felt differently. They wanted a site on the west side that could be seen from the Hudson River. And 150 naval officers signed a letter demanding that the monument be placed at 72nd Street and Riverside Drive. Another constituency were groups representing the neighborhoods. And you can probably guess how this might go. The Upper East Side Association advocated for 5th Avenue, while the West End Association, representing West Side interests, wanted the monument placed in Riverside Park. And one final group really seriously muddied the waters. In the 1890s, New York's artists, emboldened by the attention to the arts inspired by the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893, had founded several professional organizations that advocated for their interests. 3 of key importance here are the National Sculpture Society, the Municipal Arts Society, and the Fine Arts Federation. These groups forcefully inserted themselves into debate over the site. Their support was critical because in 1896, the city created a Municipal Art Commission, which was a precursor of the later Art Commission that was established in 1898 after the passage of the Consolidation Act. And the Municipal Art Commission, which had included members of 2 of these artist groups, the Municipal Arts Society and the National Sculpture Society. Their approval was required for the project to move forward, and these groups favored a Riverside location. In the midst of this messy debate, the city held a limited competition with 7 invited participants. The competitors were asked to design a shaft or arch monument for the 5th Avenue location to cost no more than $250,000. But these artists and architects must have been following the conflict over the site carefully, and some proposed grandiose plans that not only exceeded the budget, but were not feasible for the 5th Avenue site. A jury composed of 3 architects ended up selecting 2 designs, considering them of equal merit. The city selected this one by Stoughton and Stoughton, with sculpture by Frederick McMonnies. At this point, the National Sculpture Society rejects the site as inappropriate for a monument of this size. And so the fight begins again over the siting. In the end, a site in Riverside Park was selected. The opening of Grant's tomb in 1897 helped to break the logjam. While Grant's tomb is not the landmark that it once was, it was immensely popular around the turn of the century. In fact, it was the city's biggest tourist attraction until 1916. This helped finally sway support from the Grand Army veterans, who had been holdouts for the Central Park site. This settled a major point of conflict that had delayed the construction of the monument for several years. However, the National Sculpture Society threw sand in the gears again, asserting that the winning design was not appropriate for that location, that it was too small and that the site needed something more commanding. The outcome is that the monument was redesigned largely without sculpture. And this is the resulting design, more or less. The new design was essentially purely architectural, taking the form of a tholos temple, which is a round temple based on Greek and Roman precedents. The Soldiers' Monument was completed in 1902, and that reoriented the Memorial Day parade from Madison Square to Riverside Park. For much of the 20th century, the parade route began at 72nd Street and concluded between 92nd and 95th Streets. Given its late completion, the lack of sculpture has allowed the monument to gracefully serve the needs of all veterans, as there are few references to the war on the monument, except for in the inscriptions and in the plaza that surrounds it. Indeed, from the start, the monument, which was completed after the Spanish-American War of 1898, it had to incorporate veterans of other wars into its commemorative events. The monument has a beautiful interior that is rarely seen. It was intended to hold military relics and battle flags, but this never came to pass. A veteran, Andrew Stender, was initially hired as a keeper in the earliest years of the monument, and I've found no evidence, though, that he was replaced after his death in 1912, so it appears that for most of the history of this monument, it has been closed to the public. It's not entirely a public space in that it is, if you go back, behind the columns, there's one window up very high, and that is the only source of light in that entire space. So it's very dark. This photograph was taken by a commercial photographer who had a brilliant light setup, and so it looks much more ideal than you would ever see it if you were able to gain access to the structure. So it appears that the monument was mostly closed, and that all of the ceremonies that took place at the site really more or less took place outside the monument. The problem with monuments that are effectively buildings, like the Brooklyn Arch, which has an attic level space that similarly was intended for veterans to use, and the New York Soldiers and Sailors Monument, is that they are incredibly difficult to maintain. Both of these structures have had problems with water infiltration requiring extensive repairs. The case became especially dire for the Riverside Monument by the 1950s, when marble came crashing down from the decorative elements near the roof. The city determined that repairs would cost over $1 million, and some suggested that the monument should be demolished in favor of more useful urban amenities, like playgrounds. One architect drafted a proposal, which you see here, for a new memorial in a modernist idiom. And I've found this kind of curious because the architect who designed this indicated that it would have sort of stations for each of the wars as Vietnam was ongoing. And he didn't seem to have space to acknowledge that maybe wars were, a perpetual condition of society, and that there wouldn't be a finite altar for every single war in a structure like this. Fortunately, the city went forward with repair. But again, this coincided with the Vietnam War, which saw growing disillusionment with this type of commemoration. Participation in Memorial Day parades declined in the 1970s and 80s, and basically has ebbed and flowed ever since, at least around this monument, which typically does get wreath layings, but the big parades happen in Queens and Brooklyn. But restoration is never permanent. And over the years, the monument again slipped into disrepair. And it was fenced off in 2018 to protect the public once again from crumbling stonework. Fortunately, the city has allocated over $60 million in funding for its restoration. But its work on the project has not formally begun yet. They're in the bidding process for establishing the contractors for that. However, the Brooklyn Arch was also recently restored and is now it's been taken back to its full grandeur. I hope this brief tour of the city soldiers' monuments inspires you to look around at the monuments in your midst. Each of these works took years to complete. Overlooking issues of graft and partisan debate, they embody the aspirations of the city's citizens to remember the fallen through the beautification of the urban landscape. And let's hope they remain for generations to come. Thank you.
We can take a few questions, just please wait for the microphone.
The Brooklyn Soldier and Sailors Monument.
Yeah.
On the sailor side, that has the first depiction of a U.S. Marine. And that was, do you know anything about that? Because that was real rare. I'm a former Marine, but that's the earliest depiction in a monument in bronze of a Marine.
Yeah, I didn't consider that actually, but yeah, I mean, there were a few really groundbreaking things in that work, and I think part of the reason, I think because they're up somewhat high, it's hard to see the full compositions, and the other problem with those sculptures is, as you could see, they're really active. I mean, they're very tumultuous, particularly Army. And so it's tough to untangle the figures unless you can see them head on, which you can't as a spectator.
First, there was a Marine before the use of Brooklyn with the Medal of Honor. And that is, he's one of the sharpshooters at Battle of Mobile Bay.
Oh, okay.
So I don't know. I didn't know if that was part of it, maybe.
I don't know. It may well be.
Good. All right. Thank you, sir.
Good evening, this is lovely. Just not a question so much as just a comment. I was looking for my grandmother's grave. She died in 1948 and she was in Calvary, and I just stumbled on that one.
Yeah.
Thank you for the background. I had no idea it was there.
Yeah, and if you saw it, you probably noticed that it's missing some of its elements. Like the soldier that I showed you is missing his rifle, and many of the metal pieces from that from the shaft have been pulled off because there was extensive vandalism in the 1980s. So the city did a kind of test restoration of one of the figures there.
Where were these being cast? You're saying you referenced their studios, but are they being cast in New York City? Are they going to, or further away?
Yeah, Power had he cast several of these works. His studio was on 23rd Street, East 23rd, and he's the sort of figure, I mean, I find him really amazing and fascinating. I mean, he's so devious, but also you kind of like him in a way. His foundry, I think in its earliest years, when he's producing those zinc figures, is not doing great work. He actually also cast the sculpture of Samuel F.B. Morse in Central Park around that same time. Later on, when he does the Brooklyn figures of Lincoln and Grant, he is definitely, there's an article in McClure's magazine describing the process and showing a few pictures of the inside of the foundry. And at that point, he's hired a lot of French, well-trained immigrants who know sand casting and are capable of doing the more refined work that he was not able to do earlier on.
I'm guessing in your book you have many monuments that you didn't have time today. And one of the ones that comes to mind is the Augustus St. Gaudens Sherman. What can you tell us about that work, because it's so monumental? And then the second part is, I believe that the St. Gaudens Farragut was cast in Paris. And there was this big moment in New York when, to your point earlier, that from what I understand, the foundries were not up to the par that St. Gaudens was used to casting in Paris. So do you think it absolutely was the trickery of using another material, or was the quality of the foundry so bad here that casting in bronze was that difficult?
No, it wasn't that difficult. So, so the 7th Regiment monument was cast in Philadelphia by Robert Wood Foundry. St. Gaudens' work was cast in Paris. McMoney's works were cast in Paris. There were Ames Foundry was another foundry in Massachusetts that was sometimes used. So you could get decent quality bronze sculpture in the United States, but it definitely improved, certainly by like the 1880s. Part of the reason why the bronzes on the Brooklyn Arch came piecemeal was that McMoney's had a studio in France, and he wanted to hold back the sculptures to exhibit in the Paris Salon. So as he completed them, he would then put them in the French Salon for exhibition. And that usually delayed the process of getting them to the United States. And there's one really sort of crazy story about the Navy figure, the Navy group, which got stuck on the Brooklyn Bridge. And there's all these, like, it's kind of, the reporting is very funny because it's all this kind of man on the street reporting, and they're talking to, like, cartmen who are going up and looking at the sculptures, and it got held up there overnight for some reason, and then they finally got it to its site. But yeah, those were made in Paris.
Thank you for the talk. You noted early in your talk that the difference between the northern sculptures that were done by cities and the southern ones that were done by voluntary associations. Do you think that affected the style or subject matter of the monuments? And if so, could you speak briefly to that?
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the issues with Civil War commemoration is, there's so many Confederate monuments. The losing side got to declare victory in its own way through the creation of those monuments. And part of the reasons why historians have not focused on Union monuments is partly because of the anomaly of the South commemorating war in that way. And there's been this kind of weird slippage in the literature where a lot of there are similarities in the ways that both northern and southern monuments look. If you look at certain kinds of monuments, like the standing soldier figures, they appear on both sides. Part of that has to do with sort of the ideology of the South, the lost cause, the idea that slavery wasn't part of the Civil War, that it was battle states' rights, that the South lost because of superior, numbers in the North, and the North didn't have a unifying ideology that was quite as powerful as that. And so in New York City, there were a number of reasons why monuments were built and a number of methods by which they communicated that victory. And so I think there's much greater variety in northern monuments than there is in southern monuments. It also has to do with the infrastructure to some extent, because all the foundries, more or less, are up here or in Europe. And so there's not a ready supply of those sculpted forms, and in some cases they're buying them from catalogs in Connecticut, or they're getting them from northern suppliers. But I think the North is more experimental, where the North is establishing some of the forms that the South adopts, but they're also willing to embrace other types of subject matter that just doesn't appear in the South.
Yeah, just kind of following on that question, I was struck by, in a way, the lack of a story in the monuments. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, is that just because there's too many different, stories out there and nobody could really decide on a story? Or is in the lack of a story, is there almost sort of a nod to the lost cause, that you don't want to have a really ideological mm-hmm. story because it's time for the nation to grow together, and maybe that's sort of the story of the monuments.
Yeah, and that certainly is an issue, is that at least rhetorically, some of the veterans groups are very conscious of their not being too triumphant, because they're attempting to reunite and reconcile with the South. However, Brooklyn builds a triumphal arch that has some pretty, maybe not victorious imagery on it, but it's a pretty triumphant work. And so I think again, part of the issue is that the politicians don't really get into the details, and it's the artists that do, and then they end up experimenting and doing what they want. And so the idea that the lost cause and that reconciliation completely put a damper on the Union kind of celebrating its victory, I think that doesn't get fully borne out in a city like New York, where the artists are calling the shots and making the decisions.
Thank you. I'm new to this topic. I find it fascinating. Can you talk a little bit about why the city permitted Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson statues in the Bronx? And then they were removed in 2017, and is there a plan to bring them back in some way, another part of New York?
That I don't know, but I can tell you, I mean, another part of the story is that because the city was largely Democratic, it was very Southern sympathizing during the Civil War. And there were Confederate veterans groups active in the city after the war. And that is part of the reconciliation story of this idea that Lee was a great tactician and was a noble figure comes out of the lost cause, but it's also something that is embraced to some extent by veterans who want to kind of not rile up the other side and want to accept them as sort of compatriots in the same battle, in the same conflict.
Yeah, thank you. To follow up on that, you mentioned before that Brooklyn was, of course, a separate city mm-hmm. at that time, and Greenwood Cemetery has a good number of graves and more small-scale monuments as well. But to follow up on what you just said, do you feel that the degree of sympathy was the same in Brooklyn? Or was Brooklyn different than New York City at that time in terms of its sympathies?
Brooklyn was different, but it also had a very powerful democratic machine, and it also curtailed African American voting rights. It had pockets, though, of abolitionists. Beecher's Church was active, and there were certainly, I mean, I think you would call them, elites tended to be Republicans, and then, the Democratic Party was kind of the party of immigrants at that point. And, African American freedom was terrible news for the Irish in New York, in that, they competed for the same jobs. So I think that kind of prejudice was prevalent in, both Brooklyn and New York City.
Okay, thank you so much.